but a lot of the other people didn't know who Alvarez was, and that there could be a Spanish Zionist had some of the, let's say, the heathens, the uncleans, people who didn't know who he was, had them really rather perplexed. Why was someone getting so excited over an Alvarez? We had lots of Alvarez's and Sanchez's and Martinez's. Oh, yeah. And here came this blonde, blue-eyed, 6'2" ball of fire. Well, Louis worked on detonators for a while, but then Louis decided that he really wanted to get into the war. And I wanted to get into the war. And the reason for that was that, first, we never visited our parents. And I mentioned that a lot of my friends had died during the war. And people on the block, Denver was a small town then, would say, well, you know, where's your son?
Oh, yes.
Well, you know, there was a little pressure. What is this guy, a deserter? Where is he? Why isn't he? How come he doesn't come home? You don't have any pictures of him in his uniform, you know, the way everybody had pictures of their kids in the uniform. It was a very, all they could say, well, he's doing something very special and we don't know where he is. And I very much wanted to get into the war. And also I can still remember the fear I had when Pearl Harbor happened. It was on a Sunday, and I was outside, shoveling snow. And I remember how really frightened we were. And then subsequently, of course, with the fall of Bataan, and what had happened in Nanking earlier, the big massacres, and then Christmas Day, of course, Hong Kong fell. And I must say, I take my hat off to the Chinese who recently really blew the whistle on the Japanese, who were essentially rewriting their textbooks with regard to what had happened. And they, with no animosity, they just said, hey, now look, we object to this revision of your textbooks as to what really happened during those early years. And I at the time, certainly had very hard feelings toward the Japanese and the Nazis. An example of this, when I was in NATO subsequently, as science advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander, I was in the office of Air Marshal Spotswood, British airman, who was in charge of the Air Defense Division in NATO. And he was in the process of receiving his deputy, and it's an international command, and it turned out his deputy was to be a German brigadier general. And I happened to be in the office at the time when the general showed up. So Dennis Spotswood, who eventually became head of the Royal Air Force, is now Chief Air Marshal Sir Dennis Spotswood, Lord, whatever it is. He said, well, sit down. You're going to have to work with this guy eventually. I'll meet him when I meet him. So the fellow came in. He walked with a limp. And Spotswood had a dossier in front of him. He'd been checking the guy's credentials to make sure he was compatible with his responsibilities. They chatted for a while, and I just sat there and listened. In the conversation, the German pounded on his leg. And it was obviously plastic or wood, And he said, I lost it in the Battle of Britain. And Spotswood looked him right in the eye and said, you bloody well deserved it.
I mean, that's a fascinating immediate reaction.
And that, to me, was when people have subsequently said, you've done this work on the bomb and you flew over Hiroshima and these, don't you have qualms or something? And I just remember Spotswood. There's no animosity today. But at the time, they bloody well deserved it.
Yes, because he had no question about it. He had friends and officers and even family who were killed during that.
Burned, bombed, and he really understood what the conditions were at those times. And I'm afraid today many of the people, anybody under 50 essentially, just doesn't appreciate how badly the war went for us in the first years. The number of ships that were sunk, the number of people drowned, the number of casualties that we incurred. It's very interesting if you look at the statistics. If you were a prisoner of war in Germany, your survival rate was better than 98%. If you were a prisoner of war of Japan, your survival rate was less than 30%. they weren't very nice to their captives. You talk to them today and they say, well, it was because the food supplies were very low. But the survival rate of their own people was more than 30%.
And of course, according to the Geneva Convention, you're supposed to take those things into account. And incidentally, have you ever read the book called The Prisoner and the Bomb by any chance? It's a very dramatic story of this man who was taken prisoner by the Japanese, and there probably was 300,000 or 400,000 or 500,000 of them there. And as the war went along, and it was apparent that the Japanese were losing, that the ultimate plan, they found out through various devious ways, was that the Japanese were so afraid of the reprisals that they essentially were going to kill all their prisoners before leaving, before fleeing.
And then either flee or commit harikari or fight to the death.
And so that when the atomic bomb was dropped, there was a great relief because then there was a chance. All of these 400,000 prisoners had a chance of survival.
Well, I recall that I was very upset about 3 or 4 years ago in Washington, in the Senate, in the Russell Building, in the South Rotunda there was a so-called peace exhibit. Now, Senator Hatfield of Oregon had arranged for this, but when you looked at it, all it showed were the terrible effects of the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima. And there are some rather grisly pictures of that. But the whole exhibit was that. And it upset me very much, and I did write to Barry Goldwater and some people that I felt comfortable communicating with, saying, I think the peace exhibit's a fine idea, but really half of it should be, let's say Pearl Harbor, Dresden, Tokyo, showing the tremendous disaster, especially, I would say, start out with Pearl Harbor and say, this is the beginning and this is how it ended.
Yeah.
And we don't want any more of this foolishness. But it wasn't that way, and I quite frankly resented the impression that the school children who visit Washington every summer must have gotten, portraying the U.S. as the bad guys in this thing.
Oh, yes.
And people forget. There's only one place that I know that they commemorate in a proper fashion, not forgetting the atrocities, and that's Hong Kong.
Oh, yeah.
Every Christmas Day in Hong Kong, they commemorate the fall of Hong Kong, and they really call a spade as to the atrocities which were committed by the Japanese on the Brits and the Hong Kong people, especially in one hospital where they actually chopped up all the nurses and all the doctors, physically chopped them all up and put them in a pot.
That was, of course, those things you never really hear about.
You don't hear about, and that's why I get upset when on August 6th, August 9th, there are these big peace demonstrations, all essentially putting the blame on the United States for Hiroshima, which really, as you say, saved our own prisoners. And once in a while you'll have somebody come out of the woodwork, even Japanese, saying, you really saved us, because there was no way we could have surrendered other than by having something of such magnitude that the emperor said, fine.
Yeah, I had a personal experience in one of my visits to Hiroshima, and I visited that museum there, and I was one of the Americans in charge of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission went with me, and he said, there's a very interesting story, about the leaflets that were dropped, by the Air Force, warning the people in those cities.
I have some of those leaflets.
You have some original ones?
I have the original
ones.
Yes.
I have, I got some Xerox copies from the War Department, incidentally. And he said, 2 years ago, those leaflets were a part of our historical collection. And after some peace demonstrations and so forth, those leaflets have now been removed. In other words, history is being rewritten.
No, it's, I really have been upset on that. Actually, when we were overseas, as I was mentioning when we broke off, I wanted to get in the war, almost so I could, your kids want to know, what'd you do during the war, Daddy, type of thing.
Yes.
And through Louis, who convinced Oppie that here we were going to drop this bomb. We had no idea what it would do, what the yield would be, how well it would work. Shouldn't we try to measure the yield? And Oppie bought the idea, so Louis put together a team, and I must say when we heard about it, I was maybe the first in line to convince him that I should be a part of his team, and Louis bought it. And so what we did, we developed a condenser microphone which would measure the blast pressure as a function of time, magnitude and duration. And from that, we could deduce people such as Bill Penny and Klaus Fuchs, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Did the analysis from our records as to what the yield was, although nothing of that magnitude had ever been measured before. But we did fly on the first plane. We had a man named Larry. I can't think of his last name now, but it'll come to me. But Louis Alvarez and myself and Larry, who's now a professor up in Moscow, Idaho. I can't think of his last name. Anyway, we did fly on the mission, and our job was strictly to tune in our little receivers. Larry Johnson's his name, with a Larson and Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
How could I forget that?
Sure.
Okay. But we had to pick up our little transmitters. We had little FM transmitters, and the grid circuit had this condenser microphone, and that would change the frequency, and then we'd pick that up, put it through a limiter, change it to DC, and then put it on a little scope. And we used little gun cameras, black and white cameras, to record the trace. So each one of us had a different frequency, and our condenser gauges were dropped by parachute. And when the bomb was first dropped, the newspapers all said the bomb had been dropped by parachute. The bomb had not been dropped by parachute. Our gauges that they saw floating down subsequently, that had been dropped by parachute. Now it's interesting that Louis, who's a most ingenious guy, one of the things he had done, one of the famous Japanese physicists who had been at Berkeley, Louis wrote him a letter, which we taped to the condenser gauge. And he actually got it, and it was delivered to him in time that he actually had an audience with the Emperor and could explain what this was. And Louis said, there are a lot more where this came from, and this is an entirely different type of phenomenon. It's nuclear energy, which you will understand. I don't know the professor's name. And you should go to the Emperor, and you should tell him that, this is something that's beyond his power, and he should really quit. So I think Louis', again, innovativeness in his handwritten note had quite a bit to do with it.
That incidentally, that's the first time I've heard that story, and I suppose it was written up several times, but I had never heard of it before.
No, it's true, and I think Louis actually has one of those notes.
Yeah, well, that is a fascinating story there. And incidentally, just for future historians who may be listening to this, your remark about Klaus Fuchs, who might not be identified, was the famous or infamous spy who transmitted all of this information directly to the Russians.
That's right, on a monthly basis.
On a monthly basis.
He did this through some contacts in Santa Fe. Well, when we were, anyway, we had devised a method to measure the yield. We did fly, or I did fly, with Louis and Larry Johnson on the Hiroshima mission. We flew in an airplane which subsequently was the airplane that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. I did not fly on the Nagasaki mission. But an interesting note, I did take some pictures with 35 millimeter, and there was a man out there by the name of Bill Lawrence, who had been the science writer for the New York Times. Now, Lawrence, to my knowledge, was the only reporter, or journalist, who knew what was going on. He or somebody had arranged to take some 35 or 16 millimeter movie. And it so happened, as I mentioned, we did our film processing on black and white reels, gun cameras. After the raid, I knew that these pictures existed. Well, I didn't know if they'd gotten anything. But I was in the photographic room, and here were these cassettes, and it turned out they were in color, and they couldn't process it. And subsequently, Lawrence went back to the States before we went back, and these things were there. So I grabbed them. And Groves heard about this somehow. And I think the way he learned about it, again, it was Alvarez's mischievousness, I think. There was a person from either Liberty Magazine or Ladies' Home Journal or Saturday Evening Post, one of those that don't exist anymore. And Louis made an arrangement with this guy that Louis, and this guy would write an article on the bombing. But key to that were these films, which he knew I had, which I had hidden. Because my scheme was I was going to get those back to Oppie.
Oh, yes.
And I was not going to let Groves have them. We'd got message that everything we'd sent back, Groves would intercept. So the lab never got it. And the reason we were tuned to this was we were very much worried that our technical records would be grabbed by the Army and just disappear, because everything of that nature was disappearing. Groves, with all respect, I think he was really the key to the success of the project. He ran it, and he wouldn't let anything go back to the lab. Everything was being intercepted. So I decided in my own mind I wasn't going to let that happen. And when Louis and this Saturday Evening Post guy came around, I just said, I don't know what you're talking about. So we played a cat and mouse game. And then when we finally got to come back after the war, that was something after the first raid, we drew straws who would fly the second mission. Although we were very anxious to fly the first one, we weren't all that keen for the second one. It was a very long flight, and it was rather scary. I remember I wanted a gun. I wanted a gun. And I couldn't have a gun. Why couldn't I have a gun? Well, you're a civilian. And under the Geneva Convention, they said, you have this little card. This little card, if you're captured, you just give the Japanese this card, and you'll get all the courtesies of the Geneva Convention. I said, well, I wanted a gun. Well, they wouldn't let me have a gun, but one of our physicians who was with us, Jim Nolan, was Catholic, and he gave me his rosary.
Oh, yes.
It really wasn't what I had in mind, but anyway, I took it, and it worked. It was something,
yes,
and it worked.
Absolutely. Can't quarrel with that.
I gave it to him and thanked him very much, but I wanted this gun.
Yes. But incidentally, how long of an airplane flight was it?
It was about 13 hours, as I remember, round trip. It was a long time.
That is
it was a long
scary.
Time. We took off. Actually, I also have the original strike course. This is an interesting story. Anyway, I brought back these films, and every place we landed, Johnston Island, Hawaii, there would be a G2 guy there saying that he's been ordered by General Groves to get something from me. And I would just deny it. And I just kept stonewalling. And the way I was able to do it is I didn't carry the film back. I gave the film to a courier in a box. And he didn't know what was in the box. And all I had was a receipt. And I could get it from him anytime. So there was a disconnect. And they would always jump on me and go through my stuff. And they didn't know about the courier. And it went over Utah. They just about got me. We landed there again before going into Albuquerque. And they really, the whole gang of them were there and wanted it. And fortunately, I said, well, I didn't believe they were who they said they were. They would have to authenticate that. And by the time they could do that, we were refueled and we were on our way again. But when we got to Albuquerque, they really had me. So I cut a deal with them that they could come up to Los Alamos with me, and we would present the case to Oppie. Because my objective was to get those things to Oppie.
Oh, yes.
So we got to Los Alamos, and the courier brought the stuff up, and I explained to Oppie privately that I didn't know if there was anything on them or not. But they might be the only pictures of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Oppie said, great. He called in Julian Mack, and gave them Julian Mack, who was head of photography. And Mack went out the back door and went to the West Coast, because that was the only place you could process color film. And Oppie said that we would develop them, and that they were gone. That's all there was to it. They were gone. He'd taken care of it, but he would certainly make certain that the general had copies if there was anything there. Well, it turned out there was something there, and those are the only movies of the bombing. Now, when I left Los Alamos, or before I left, when Aki left, he gave me the originals. And I've had these originals for a long time, and people have used them. Mostly the Japanese have used them. And the reason I'm mentioning this, I've had a terrible time. I've had them for years, and one night I was having dinner with Lane Kirtland, who is AFL-CIO president now, and Senator Bob Packwood.
Oh, yes.
And Lane knew about these because people have used them. And he gave me a real lecture of where are they? And I said, oh, they're in the closet at home. And he, of course, read the Riot Act. They weren't being kept properly and everything. And Packwood was on the Smithsonian board. And he said, you should give these to the Smithsonian. Well, I started communicating with the Smithsonian and with the National Archives. And the more I thought about it, the more I decided, no, the place that should have them, and that's where they are today, is a Hoover Institute.
Oh, yes.
Because they have